Some people say that the Bible's full of all these grand miracles. If you look through the Bible, there's actually very few miracles described. In fact, they typically are all concentrated around the time of Moses and the time of Christ. And then there's a few spattered throughout the middle, but that's not the normal thing that the Scripture portrays, is miraculous events. In fact, part of the reason for these events being recorded is to point to us and tell us that Jesus is not a mere man. He is not a mere human. And then you go here in this passage and we'll see him dealing with a man under. And then the next section you'll see that he is dealing with, he heals a lady who had a lifetime illness for over 12 years in a very subtle way. And then it culminates in a very subtle way with him showing that he has victory over even death itself. Again, these are all powers that establish in each case. It is pointed out that that it's not something that normal people do. Even in the lady who had this illness for 12 years, she'd gone to doctors for 12 years and had literally wiped out her financial resources going to doctors and not finding any results. So we find here this emphasis of Jesus being something beyond. And of course, we know what that is. He is the Son of God. So allow me to read it to you out of the ESV. Beginning chapter 5 of Mark, beginning in verse 1. he came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with chains, for he had often been bound with shackles and chains. But he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I adjourn you by God not to torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, "Send us out to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them possession. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbered about 2,000, rushed down the steep banks into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it to the city and to the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, and the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described it to them, what had happened, and to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. It's very interesting. A lot's going on in this passage, in this section. We see a whole bunch of different things. You hear a man who is clearly under great distress. And it's interesting that you see that this area that Jesus was in was not a Jewish area, but was a Gentile territory known as the Decapolis, which was a 10-city area. And they were independent. They were part of the Roman Empire, but they were independent states, or independent city-states within the Roman Empire. The Romans did not really concern themselves with the internal business of these cities, as long as they were loyal to the empire, paid their taxes, and the Romans could send their troops through there, going to their enemies across the borders. So the Romans were responsible for protecting them, but at the same time, there was not imperial rule directly over them. So you have this area of Gentiles, and that's why you have all this herd of pigs, because in the Jewish areas, you did not raise pigs. But in the Gentile areas, you could raise pigs. Now, there's always an exception to most rules. I remember when I was working at Megiddo, there in the archaeological dig in Megiddo, we stayed in a kibbutz, and this was a secular kibbutz. It was kind of interesting because the women still insisted on having the Friday Sabbath service at the meals on Friday evenings, but it was a secular kibbutz. And this secular kibbutz was the only place that you could go in the land of Israel to buy ham, bacon, or anything like that, because they raised pigs. And the kibbutz had all these, you had all these little bungalows that you lived in, and we, the the excavation team, we stayed in like a little hotel that they had. But on the other side of the kibbutz were all these high rises. And since it was against the law to raise pigs on Israeli soil, the pigs were raised in the high rises. So that was their way of getting around that law. As the pigs had the high rises, the people had the bungalows. But anyways, it was, but this is, a situation, similar type thing, except this would have been a Gentile area. They raised pigs, and so they would have had a corner of the market. It was a big thing for them. And it's very interesting when they hear about the event, they all come and they see the man restored. If you notice that, they see the man restored. They see him fully clothed in his right mind. Probably by that time, the disciples had given him a haircut and shaved. Who knows what all. They'd cleaned him up. They see this man has been restored, but they also count the pigs that they have lost. And so they ask Jesus, could you please leave? For it is very common how often the gospel counters economic claims. We see that with Alexander in Ephesus, who was part of the silver trade. And when people started becoming Christians, they stopped buying all the silver idols and stuff. And so the business people started getting antsy and actually started a riot against Paul. And Paul became persona non grata. Believe it or not, the number one force that opposed missionary work throughout India and all those parts of the world where like the East Indies Trading Company, were all the trading companies and corporations, everybody that was involved, because they did not want the missionaries messing with their profits. England actually went to war with China so that they could procure and maintain the opium trade. So, it's very interesting, even governments that we would consider good governments have been known to do bad things for profits. But I'm going to focus in on the earlier part. The thing that intrigued me this time around as I was looking at this passage is the response of the man who was demon-possessed and the pigs. It is very interesting that with the moment that the pigs sensed this evil, harmful spirit taking possession of their beings, what did they do? They immediately went out and ran off and went into the water and drowned themselves. They could not stand, and they were not able to withhold that presence of that evil, so much so that they had an intense drive to destroy themselves. Now, that should not shock us, because if we understand the nature of evil, it makes perfectly good sense. Evil and good are not equals. They're not equals. Okay? Good is greater than evil. In fact, evil, at its most basic point, is simply the perversion of that which is good. Evil takes something that is good and twists it and takes it and makes it into something harmful, something hurtful, something that is destructive. Now, you may say, you've gone to college, you've gone to the philosophy classes and everything, and they talk about how good and evil, and they treat them equally. Well, think about it. We can bring this down to a very concrete example of this. Good can exist without the presence of evil. Evil cannot exist without the presence of a good. And take this mental exercise. A healthy body, by definition, does not have any illnesses. And it exists, and it prospers, and it does well. But then there comes an illness. And an illness needs a living body. Notice how I changed the word. A living body to exist. So let's take cancer, for example. This is a nice concrete example. When cancer comes along, Basically, cancer is basically humans, it's your cells of your own body that are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And they're reproducing themselves. They're making themselves more numerous, but they're not helping the body. They're doing their own thing. They're not working. They're not doing their part to help that body. Now, that cancer, if it's not taken care of and if it's not eliminated, whatever treatment you have, eventually will do what? Take over the body. And when it takes over the body, what happens? The body dies. And then when the body dies, what happens to the cancer? It dies too. So you see there, evil is not, when you talk about did God create evil? No, he created the good, but then the good was perverted. And we have to understand that evil is always a perversion of a good. So there's always a good within evil, but it's just perverting it. Now this man was hit with these evil, harmful spirits. Now, evidently, he still had a strong desire. He may have understood. He may not have wanted to face the judgment day. We don't know how he got involved with these evil spirits. We don't know if it started out with little games and it grew, because that's typically how evil does. It starts out real small in our lives, and then it kind of grows a little bit more. And if we're not careful, it gets to the point like we see in Romans chapter 7, where it ends up ruling our lives and directing our activities and our actions, to where we know that we shouldn't be doing this or that, but we're doing it anyways because of whatever it is that's pushing us. But at first, it usually starts small. You can think about the thing that came in my mind as thinking about these was there used to be a series called VeggieTales, and it's still around, but it's not as popular as it used to be. And you had several things. There's two that came in mind, but I kept conflating the two in my mind, and I didn't have time to separate them out to get the story. But the one that dominates my mind is the one of the rumor read, and how a little statement, a little misstatement ends up growing and growing and growing and growing until it has a whole town up in arms. And there's another one where there's a little lie, and Junior tells a little lie, and every time he turns around, he has to make the lie bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until the lie starts to dominate his life and control his life. And that's the way evil is. It may start out, we can think we can control it, but then after a while it gets a little bit bigger, and it gets a little bit bigger, and it gets a little bit bigger, and suddenly we realize it controls us. We see this all the way back into Genesis before Cain killed Abel. God talks to Cain and says, hey, you know things aren't right. And you know if you do what's right, everything will be restored, it'll be okay. But if you don't, God tells Cain it's a very strange statement. Sin is crouching at your door, and it desires you and to have dominion over you. It desires you and to have dominion over you. Now this man, he's in a place where he has this dominion that he's doing, and we can see it in his lifestyle. Evidently, he had very antisocial behavior on a regular, was very antisocial, and even self-destructive behavior was going on in his life. So much so that his community, if you look at it, had tried to bind him and send him off to the asylum, trying to limit his activities or try to keep him from hurting others or hurting themselves. But he was so intense, so under this influence, so bitter, so angry, so whatever was going on in his life, that he literally tore the chains apart. And he literally would crush the shackles that were on him. And, basically you probably just kept pounding at him until they did. While a normal person would stop because we would be hurt, but he would not. And then he would go out and he'd be crying and yelling all night. You can imagine if you were near the area hearing him yell all night. And he was doing what we call today as cutting. And he wasn't using a sharp knife. He was using stones. He was inflicting pain upon himself. But the thing that is interesting, he evidently still clinged to life. He still held to life. He hadn't gotten to that point that he just gave up to the evil and let the evil take over and destroy him completely. Yes, he was mutilating himself. Yes, he was alienating himself from his friends and family. Yes. But he was still clinging to life. And we look at this passage, and it's very interesting when you take it in context. As I said, some view the storm that Jesus and the disciples encountered was an attempt to keep Jesus from meeting this man. Because when Jesus comes ashore, the man sees him. And evidently Jesus or the Holy Spirit had been calling this man. Well, last week we saw that sometimes God sends us into difficult situations. Here we see God probably sending a man who is under a difficult situation to the solution of his problems. Now, granted, at this time, the influences in this man's life were not ready for it on their own terms. And they argued with Jesus. They were like a little kid. Just, no, don't do this to us. They didn't know whether to be, we don't know exactly what it is that they mean by torment. The most theologians take it that if Jesus just sent them out, that they would be somehow absorbed and sent to hell. We don't know exactly how Christ was tormenting the tormentors. We're not told. There's a lot that's not being seen in this passage. But God is at work. And eventually Jesus frees him. Evidently that man in his depths is still clinging to life and somehow was able to seek God in that deep, deep darkness. Because Christ evidently went out of his way to meet him. The Holy Spirit worked and drove him to Christ. Because if you were knowing that somebody was coming and was going to take away your source of fun and food, what would you do? You would move to another direction, would you not? You would avoid. That's what the normal reaction is, to avoid. But this guy is driven to Jesus. So the one thing we quickly learn is that even a person in the deepest, darkest times, under the deepest and most difficult of oppressions, where evil spirits are tormenting him day and night, is still able to seek God in some form, in some way. I do not know how. Is still able to turn and seek the help of God. And on top of that, we find God is willing to come and provide this man relief. Now, evidently, this man is not like many others whom Jesus describes. They get rid of the harmful spirits in their lives and they send them away. And you go to Mark, later in Mark, where Jesus describes this, and the demons go out, and then they clean up their lives on their own strength. They get everything all lined up, and everything's well, and then the demons come back and bring in more. Maybe this guy had done that, cleaned his life up many times before, but each time the demons came back with more and more and more and oppressed him. But this time, his healing came from the Son of God. His healing was complete and whole. Notice that the man wanted to stay with Jesus. He wanted to become a follower of Jesus, though he did not realize he was already a follower of Jesus. But Jesus had a mission for him. Jesus could not go into the Decapolis area because the people were saying, "Don't come. We don't want you around here. We don't want you to ruin our business." But he sent that man back to his friends and family to give testimony to what he had done. So we find that Jesus was even concerned for those who were telling him, "Don't come back." He was seeking to bring the gospel to them. Even though they weren't Jews, even though they didn't want him, he was still willing to send them a witness. as we reflect upon these things, and it's been kind of interesting reflecting on all these things, is that, what can we draw away from this? On the one hand, we need to understand that evil is simply a perversion of good. There's always some good within that evil, but it's been perverted. It's been twisted into something that it should not be, doing things that it should not be doing. So that means the second thing that we pick up here is as long as there's life, there is hope. As long as there's life, there is hope. We have an epidemic throughout our country in suicides. Part of the reason is that we have made suicide attractive and beautiful and something that everybody accepts officially. We should never accept suicide as an option. Even in our darkest moments, we should never accept it. Could you imagine had he given in to those urges and done as the pigs? He would have no longer had hope. But he did not. Yes, his life was miserable. Yes, he was hollering all night. Yes, he was cutting himself. Yes, he was antisocial. Yes, you couldn't control him. Yes. But he held on to life and somehow found the God of life. And I don't know how, because God works in ways that are beyond my understanding. And so we need to always tell people, do not consider, don't even joke about suicide, especially in our culture, because our culture has reduced it so much that people do it over the most trivial things at times. We don't want to be like the pigs. We desire that everybody comes to Christ. And don't joke around about suicide or anything like that. Don't take it, if anybody makes a statement that they're going to do this or do that, get them to promise not to do that. You do what you have to get them not to do such a thing. Get them to promise to call you or touch base with you or anything but that. Because we do not want to send. Yes, I can imagine that man's friends and families were all horrified about the way he lived, and were all ashamed about the way he lived. But even in the death, they would still be in the same situation. But since he held on to life and found the God of life, now they could hear his testimony about his transformed life and realize how powerful God really is. Because that's how God works, by hearing the testimony of how God has transformed us. And that's why those of us who've been in the deep, dark valleys, when we can say, I've overcome that, that helps others to overcome similar things. Not dwelling on those deep, dark valleys, but how God has taken me out of that deep, dark valley. That is what gives hope. So, secondly, we should come and realize, not view suicide as something that is A-okay or acceptable, but something that basically ends all hope. And then finally, we as Christians, those of us who know the Lord, need to be able to understand that God is able to reach out to those that we have no way of reaching out to. If we were his friends and family, we probably could do nothing for him. There was nothing there that we could do for him, except maybe appeal to God to intervene. Notice the word intervene, intervention. Not just heal, but intervene. Maybe this man was was redeemed because others were praying for him. So we need to be the same way, praying for others as we go forward. So in the deepest and darkest of times, still seek the Lord. Still depend upon the God